When the moon turns crimson and shadows come alive, only Van Helsing can face the darkness. Welcome to Mr. Vault Stories.
Van Helsing, The Crimson Covenant. An echo of shadows in the vein of Stoker. Chapter 1. The Summons of Shadows. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls of Van Helsing's study. Rows of ancient tomes and leather-bound journals lined the shelves, their dusty spines whispering stories of monsters, curses, and forbidden knowledge. Outside, the wind moaned like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters and echoing through the narrow streets of Amsterdam. Van Helsing sat in his armchair, staring into the flames as if they held the answers to the ghosts that haunted him. His wire-rimmed glasses slipped down his nose, but he didn't bother adjusting them. His mind was elsewhere, back in the crypts of Transylvania, where the scent of death and the chill of stone still lingered in his memory. He shivered and shut the journal resting on his lap. It had been years since Dracula's defeat, but the victory had not brought peace. Nightmares plagued him, twisting his sleep into tortured visions of crimson eyes and shadowy figures lurking just beyond his reach. Tonight was no different. A sudden knock at the door shattered his reverie. Van Helsing blinked, momentarily disoriented, before rising from his chair. The knock came again, louder this time. He crossed the room and opened the heavy oak door, revealing a messenger wrapped in a tattered coat, his breath visible in the frigid night air. "Professor Van Helsing?" the man asked, his voice hoarse. Van Helsing nodded. The man extended a gloved hand, holding out an envelope sealed with an unfamiliar wax crest, a coiled serpent encircling a crescent moon. "Urgent correspondence from Romania, sir." Van Helsing accepted the letter and pressed a coin into the messenger's hand. Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the fog-laden street. Van Helsing closed the door, his fingers trembling slightly as he broke the seal. "Professor Van Helsing, I write to you from the Carpathian Mountains, where shadows stretch long over my ancestral home. My family, the Vardas line, is accursed, plagued by a darkness that neither priest nor scholar has been able to banish. My brother Radu is lost to madness, and the servants whisper of things that creep by moonlight. I beg of you, come to Castle Vardas. You are our last hope. Yours in desperation, Lady Elona Vardas." His gaze lingered on the postscript. "He knows your name." Van Helsing's breath hitched. The ink seemed to pulse, as if alive with intent. Could it be? Had something survived, some remnant of the evil they had fought so hard to destroy? He closed his eyes, the flames in the hearth roaring louder in his mind. For a brief moment, he thought he heard Dracula's voice, mocking him from the grave. "Did you truly think it was over, old man?" Sleep did not find him that night. He paced the study, the letter crumpled in his hand, and debated whether he should answer this new call to arms. He'd given so much: his youth, his strength, his friends. Was there anything left of him to give? By dawn, the answer was clear. The ghosts of the past would never rest until he confronted whatever new horror awaited him. He packed his trunk with meticulous care, each item chosen as if for a final battle. Crucifixes, silver stakes, vials of holy water, and a worn leather journal filled with notes on the supernatural. At the train station, a gray fog clung to the platform, muffling the sounds of departing locomotives. Van Helsing boarded the carriage bound for Romania, settling into a corner seat by the window. As the train began its slow departure, he gazed out at the retreating city, his thoughts already lost in the labyrinth of possibilities. The journey through Europe blurred into a haze of passing landscapes, the bustling cities of Western Europe giving way to rural villages, and finally the wild, untamed wilderness of the Carpathians. With each mile closer to his destination, the air grew colder, the forests denser, and the sense of foreboding heavier. The final station was a lonely outpost nestled in a valley, where the only sign of life was a waiting coach. The driver, an old man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too many winters, helped Van Helsing load his trunk. "Castle Vardas, is it?" the driver asked, his voice tinged with unease. Yes, Van Helsing replied, climbing into the carriage. The driver crossed himself and cracked the reins, urging the horses forward. As they wound their way up the narrow mountain road, the driver muttered about wolves and curses. They say the wolves here have human eyes, he said, casting a wary glance at the dark forest, and they do not fear fire. Van Helsing remained silent, his mind racing with thoughts of what he might find at Castle Vardas. The familiar unease of hunting the unknown settled over him like an old coat. He was no stranger to fear, but this time it felt different, more personal. The castle loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the blood-red sky of dusk. Its towers pierced the heavens like spears, and ivy crept along its crumbling walls, as if nature itself sought to reclaim it. The iron gates groaned as they opened, revealing a courtyard bathed in shadow. Lady Ilona awaited him at the entrance, her form illuminated by the flickering light of a lantern. She was younger than he had imagined, perhaps in her late 20s, but her eyes held an ancient sorrow. "Professor Van Helsing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming." He bowed slightly. "Lady Vardas, I could not ignore your plea." She led him through the grand, decaying corridors of the castle, where every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo the whispers of long-dead ancestors. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something fouler. When they reached the study, she turned to face him, her eyes brimming with desperation. "Please, tell me you can help us. My brother's madness grows worse by the day, and the servants speak of things that walk the halls at night." Van Helsing placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I will do everything in my power, but first you must tell me everything." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as though eager to join their conversation. Lady Ilona began her tale, and with each word, Van Helsing's resolve hardened. Whatever darkness had taken root in Castle Vardas, it would soon find itself face to face with the man who had vanquished Dracula. The shadows had summoned him, but they had made a grave mistake. Chapter 2. The Carpathian Lament. The wheels of the carriage jolted over the uneven path, each bump sending vibrations through Van Helsing's weary frame. The narrow road snaked its way through a dense, foreboding forest, where twisted branches overhead formed a canopy that blocked even the feeble rays of the morning sun. The only sounds were the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. It was the kind of silence that weighed heavily on the mind, amplifying every creak and whisper. The driver, an old man with hollow cheeks and eyes that darted nervously to the trees, seemed determined to avoid conversation. When Van Helsing finally broke the silence, his voice was calm, but probing. "The wolves here. You mentioned they have human eyes." The driver flinched, as if the very mention of the creatures could summon them from the shadows. He crossed himself quickly and tightened his grip on the reins. "Aye, sir, they do. Not many have seen them up close and lived to tell of it, but those who have say their eyes burn with hatred. It's as if they know you, like they're hunting something more than flesh." Van Helsing nodded, filing the information away. He had learned long ago that local superstitions often carried kernels of truth, hidden beneath layers of fear and exaggeration. The carriage crested a hill, and Castle Vardas came into view. It loomed in the distance like a wounded beast, its jagged towers stabbing at the sky. The walls were cloaked in ivy, their once proud stonework now cracked and weathered by centuries of decay. The surrounding forests seemed to press in on the castle, as if nature itself sought to reclaim it. "We're here," the driver muttered, pulling the carriage to a stop near the iron gates. He wasted no time dismounting and unloading Van Helsing's trunk. "I'll be off before night falls, if it pleases you. There's nothing good about staying near this place after dark." Van Helsing offered a polite nod and handed the man a coin. "Safe travels?" The driver tipped his hat and climbed back into the carriage, urging the horses into a brisk trot. Van Helsing watched him disappear down the road, then turned toward the gates. They groaned as he pushed them open. their rusted hinges protesting loudly. The courtyard beyond was overgrown with weeds. The stone pathway cracked and uneven. At the entrance to the castle stood Lady Ilona Vardas, her figure framed by the arched doorway. She held a lantern in one hand, its light casting flickering shadows across her pale face. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her black dress clung to her form like mourning cloth. "Professor Van Helsing," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and despair. "Thank you for coming." He bowed slightly, his gaze studying her with quiet intensity. "It is an honor to be of service, Lady Vardas. But tell me, how long has your brother been afflicted?" Her eyes flickered with pain. "For months now. At first it was only nightmares. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, mumbling about shadows and blood. But then he withdrew from the world. He locked himself in the tower, refused to eat, and spoke only in cryptic whispers." She hesitated, then added, 2 weeks ago, one of our servants was found dead near the edge of the forest. His body was drained of blood, and there were puncture marks on his neck." Van Helsing's gaze sharpened. "And you believe your brother is responsible?" Ilona closed her eyes briefly, as if trying to block out the memory. "I don't know. I don't want to believe it, but the villagers do. They speak of the Crimson Covenant, a curse tied to our bloodline." "The Crimson Covenant?" Van Helsing repeated, intrigued. She nodded. "They say an ancestor of mine made a pact with a dark force generations ago, trading purity for prosperity. But curses like that are the stuff of folklore, aren't they?" "Not always," Van Helsing replied grimly. "Tell me, have you seen any other signs? Things you cannot explain?" "Yes," she admitted. "At night, the walls seem to breathe. I hear whispers in the corridors, as if the castle itself is speaking. And sometimes, I feel as though I am being watched, even when I'm alone." Van Helsing placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing by calling me. Together, we will uncover the truth." She led him through the grand entrance hall, its once opulent decor, now a shadow of its former glory. Tattered tapestries hung limply from the walls, their colors faded to muted shades of brown and gray. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something fouler, something metallic, the unmistakable scent of blood. "Your brother is in the East Wing," Ilona said, guiding him up a spiral staircase. "I haven't been able to reach him for days. He keeps the door locked." "I will speak to him," Van Helsing said, adjusting his satchel. "But first, I need to see the place where the servant was found." She hesitated, then nodded. "I will take you there." They exited through a side door and made their way into the forest surrounding the castle. The air was cold and damp, and the trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches casting skeletal shadows on the ground. "It was here," Ilona said, stopping near a clearing where the underbrush had been trampled. The ground was stained dark, and Van Helsing knelt to examine the area. He ran his fingers over the soil, noting the faint metallic scent. "No signs of struggle," he murmured. "Whatever attacked him was swift and deliberate." He looked up at Ilona. "Were there any tracks?" "No," she replied. The villagers searched, but found nothing. Van Helsing stood and dusted off his hands. "I will need to inspect your brother's room tonight. If he is indeed the cause of this, then the signs will be there." Ilona's lips trembled. "And if he is beyond saving?" Van Helsing met her gaze, his expression grave. "Then I will do what must be done." As they made their way back to the castle, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a mournful spirit. Van Helsing tightened his grip on his satchel, knowing that this night would be the first of many battles against whatever evil lurked within the walls of Castle Vardas. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Crypt. The village lay nestled in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains. Its thatched roofs and wooden shutters closed tightly against the creeping fog that blanketed the valley. Van Helsing and Lady Ilona entered the narrow streets in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of mud beneath them. The air smelled of damp earth and chimney smoke, but there was an underlying scent, faint but unmistakable, of decay. Villagers peered cautiously from behind curtains, their eyes wide with suspicion. None dared approach, though Van Helsing could feel their presence like unseen fingers pressing against his back. He knew this look well, fear intertwined with resentment, as though they both wanted his help and dreaded the truths he might uncover. At the heart of the village stood a small stone chapel, its steeple crooked, and its wooden cross sagging, as though the building itself had grown weary under the weight of so many unanswered prayers. The priest who emerged to greet them was an elderly man with sunken eyes and a tremor in his hands. He introduced himself as Father Anton. "Lady Vardas," he said, his voice tinged with sympathy, "and you must be Professor Van Helsing. We have been expecting you." "Then you know why we are here," Van Helsing replied, stepping forward. Father Anton nodded grimly. "The villagers speak of the Crimson Covenant, of ancient evils that sleep beneath our feet. I can show you the crypt, but be warned. What you find there may haunt you." "The truth often does," Van Helsing said. The priest led them down a narrow path behind the chapel, where moss-covered gravestones leaned haphazardly, as if the dead themselves had tried to escape the soil. They stopped before a stone staircase leading underground. The entrance was marked by a weathered carving of an angel, its wings cracked and broken. "This crypt predates the chapel," Father Anton explained, holding a lantern high. "It was built when the first settlers came to this valley, long before the Vardas family took residence in the castle. The frescoes within tell of a bargain struck in blood." Van Helsing descended the stairs, the cold, damp air biting at his skin. Ilona followed closely, her lantern casting flickering shadows that danced like restless spirits on the walls. The scent of mildew and something older, something dead, filled the narrow passageway. At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a circular chamber lined with alcoves containing stone sarcophagi. "The frescoes are here," Father Anton said, pointing to the walls. Van Helsing raised his lantern, illuminating the ancient paintings. The images were faded, but their message remained clear. Hooded figures performing blood rituals beneath a crimson moon. A woman in white bound to an altar, and a monstrous figure with glowing red eyes holding a chalice of blood. Above them, strange symbols that Van Helsing could not immediately decipher curled like serpents along the borders of the scenes. Ilona's breath hitched. "This is the covenant, isn't it? My ancestor made this pact." "Yes," Van Helsing replied, his voice somber, "and I fear it was never truly broken. These frescoes depict more than a warning. They are a record of a ritual meant to be renewed." He traced his fingers over the symbols. "Every generation, the covenant demands a sacrifice of purity to sustain its power." Ilona stepped back, her face pale. "Then Radu is the consequence of a failure to uphold the bargain," Van Helsing finished. "If the covenant is not renewed, the curse corrupts the bloodline itself. Radu is trapped between life and death, a thrall to the entity your ancestor invoked." Before Ilona could respond, a sound echoed through the crypt, a faint rustling, as though something ancient had stirred from its slumber. Father Anton gripped his lantern tightly. "This place is cursed," he whispered. "We should leave." "Not yet," Van Helsing said, moving toward an alcove where a large stone sarcophagus rested. He examined the lid, noting the intricate carvings of serpents and moons. "This symbol, it is the same as the seal on Lady Ilona's letter." Ilona shivered. "What does it mean?" Van Helsing's expression darkened. "It marks the resting place of one who was bound to the covenant. If the entity still lingers, it will be here." He retrieved a vial of holy water from his satchel and uncorked it. "Step back." Ilona and Father Anton obeyed as Van Helsing poured the holy water along the edges of the sarcophagus. The liquid hissed and bubbled as if the stone itself were burning. The chamber trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. Suddenly, a swarm of bat-like creatures erupted from the shadows, their leathery wings flapping violently. Their eyes glowed with a sickly red light, and their mouths were filled with sharp, needle-like teeth. "Stay behind me!" Van Helsing shouted, pulling a silver dagger from his belt. The creatures descended upon them with terrifying speed. Van Helsing struck one midair, driving the dagger into its chest. It shrieked and disintegrated into ash. Another lunged toward Ilona, but she swung her lantern, the flame catching the creature's wing and sending it spiraling to the ground. Father Anton fell to his knees, muttering prayers as Van Helsing fought off the remaining creatures. His movements were precise, honed by years of experience. One by one, the creatures fell until the crypt was silent once more, save for the heavy breathing of its occupants. Van Helsing wiped the sweat from his brow and turned to Ilona. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her hands trembled. "No. But what were those things?" "Minions of the Cremonius," Van Helsing said grimly. "They are corrupted souls, bound to protect the Covenant." He glanced at the sarcophagus. "Whatever is inside this tomb, it is powerful enough to command them." Father Anton crossed himself. "You must destroy it, Professor." Van Helsing nodded. "We will. But not yet. First, we need to understand how deep this curse runs. If we act prematurely, we may awaken something far worse." He helped Ilona to her feet and led her back toward the staircase. As they ascended, the weight of what they had seen pressed down on them like a funeral shroud. "This is only the beginning," Van Helsing murmured. "The Cremonius has already marked its next victim. We must uncover its weakness before it is too late." Above them, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant cry of a wolf, a sound that seemed almost human. Chapter 4. The Blooded Tome, Revised. The flickering light of the library's fire cast long shadows on the stone walls, as if the room itself shared in the weight of Van Helsing's grim discoveries. Lady Ilona sat in an armchair near the hearth, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She stared at the blooded tome resting on the table between them, its cracked leather cover marred by stains that had long since dried, but still whispered of violence. Van Helsing leaned over the table, his fingers tracing the serpent and moon symbol embossed on the cover. The air in the library felt oppressive, as if the very knowledge contained within the book had poisoned it. "You found this in the catacombs beneath the chapel?" Van Helsing asked, his voice low and measured. Ilona nodded, her gaze never leaving the tome. "It was hidden inside an iron chest, sealed as if someone wanted to bury its secrets forever. But I thought it might hold the key to saving Radu." "It does," Van Helsing said grimly, opening the book to its first page. The brittle parchment crackled under his touch. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible, an intricate mix of Latin and archaic symbols that pulsed with sinister meaning. But it also tells of the curse's origins and the cost of breaking it. He flipped through the pages, stopping at an illustration that chilled him to the bone. The image depicted a man kneeling before a hooded figure, offering a cup filled with blood. Surrounding them were serpentine symbols intertwined with depictions of sacrificial altars and moonlit rituals. "Your ancestor, Count Vadas," Van Helsing murmured, pointing to the figure. "This is where it began. He struck a bargain with the Cremonius, offering a sacrifice of purity in exchange for wealth and power. But the covenant was not a one-time offering. It demands renewal every generation." Ilona's breath hitched. "But we didn't renew it. We've done nothing to uphold the covenant. And that is precisely why it has returned," Van Helsing said, turning another page. "When the covenant is broken, the Cremonius exacts its price by corrupting the family's bloodline. Radu is its victim, transformed into a thrall because the sacrifice was denied." Ilona covered her mouth, her tears slipping through her fingers. "Is there any way to save him?" Van Helsing hesitated. He had seen curses like this before, where dark forces wormed their way into a victim's soul, twisting them into something monstrous. But there was something different about the Cremonius. Its influence ran deeper, binding itself not just to the flesh, but to the spirit. "There is one way," he finally said, his tone cautious. "The Lumina Crucifix. It is a relic forged to break blood pacts and sever demonic bonds. But even with the crucifix, we must first weaken the Cremonius by cutting off its ties to this realm." Ilona wiped her tears, her determination hardening. "Where can we find this relic?" Van Helsing glanced at the tome and traced the Latin passage beneath the illustration. The crucifix was hidden centuries ago by a secret order of monks who feared its power would be misused. If my understanding is correct, it lies within an ancient sanctuary, deep in the Carpathian Mountains. He closed the book. But there's something else you need to know, Lady Ilona. She met his gaze, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. What is it? Van Helsing leaned forward, his voice a whisper. The Crimonios will not simply wait for us to break the covenant. It will do everything in its power to claim you, because you are the final key. The blood of the Vardas family is tied to the curse, and your purity sustains its hold. If you are sacrificed, the covenant will be renewed, and the creature will be unstoppable. Ilona's face paled, but she did not waver. Then we must move quickly. What do you need me to do? Before Van Helsing could answer, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. The door burst open, revealing Dr. Emil Kovac, his face flushed with excitement and fear. Professor Van Helsing, he exclaimed. I need you to see this, now. Van Helsing stood, his instincts sharpening. What is it, Doctor? The creature we captured during the attack in the crypt, Emil said breathlessly. I've been studying its blood. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. It regenerates rapidly, as if it's alive even outside the body. And he hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Ilona. It reacts to her presence. Van Helsing's expression darkened. Show me. The three of them hurried down the winding corridors of the castle, the torches casting flickering shadows on the walls. They entered a laboratory where the captured bat-like creature lay on a table, its wings pinned and its body convulsing weakly. Nearby, vials of its dark, viscous blood pulsed as if they were alive. Emil picked up one of the vials. Watch. He brought it closer to Ilona, and the blood inside writhed, pressing against the glass, as though it were trying to reach her. It's drawn to her, Van Helsing murmured. The curse recognizes her as the key. Ilona stepped back, her breath shallow. Then we're running out of time. Indeed, Van Helsing said, gripping the edge of the table. We must retrieve the Lumina crucifix before the Crimonios makes its final move. He turned to Emil. Destroy the blood samples and burn the remains of this creature. If any part of it lingers, the curse could spread. Emil hesitated, his scientific curiosity warring with the urgency of the situation. But a sharp glance from Van Helsing made him nod. I understand. Van Helsing led Ilona out of the laboratory, his mind racing. The path ahead was treacherous, but they had no choice. The Crimonios had marked its prey, and the only way to break its hold was to confront it head-on. As they reached the castle's entrance, Van Helsing placed a reassuring hand on Ilona's shoulder. You are stronger than you think, Lady Ilona, and when the time comes, that strength will be what saves you. She nodded, her resolve solidifying like steel. Then let's find the crucifix and end this. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the distant sound of wolves, or something far more sinister. But Van Helsing's grip on the blooded tome tightened. They had the knowledge, and soon they would have the weapon. The shadows would not win this time. Chapter 5. The Turning Tide, revised. Night had fallen over Castle Vardas, casting its crumbling walls into deep shadow beneath the ominous glow of the crimson moon. The forest outside was eerily silent, the usual symphony of night creatures replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness. Van Helsing stood at the castle's east window, watching the blood-red light bathe the distant treetops. His fingers traced the cold glass as he thought of what lay ahead. Behind him, Lady Ilona paced the length of the library, her movements restless and filled with suppressed anxiety. The room's dim lanterns flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced like specters. We don't have much time, do we? Ilona asked, her voice breaking the heavy silence. No, Van Helsing replied without turning from the window. Once the crimson moon reaches its peak, the Crimonios will make its move. We must act before it does. The door creaked open, and Dr. Emil Kovac entered, his face pale and drawn. He carried a notebook clutched to his chest, its pages smudged with ink and hurried scribbles. "I've destroyed the blood samples as you requested," he said, setting the notebook on the table. "But I've been studying what little I could before they were burned. There's something you need to know." Van Helsing turned sharply. "Go on." Emil hesitated, his eyes darting to Ilona. The creature's blood wasn't just drawn to her. It was evolving. It was adapting to her presence, as though it recognized her not just as prey, but as the catalyst it needed to reach its full power. Ilona's hands tightened around the back of a chair, her knuckles turning white. "So I'm the key, as you said before." "Yes," Van Helsing said, pacing toward her. "The Cremonios doesn't just want to sacrifice you. It wants to consume you entirely. Your essence will renew the covenant, allowing the entity to manifest fully in this world." The weight of his words settled over the room like a suffocating fog. Ilona took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. "Then we can't let that happen. What's our next move?" Van Helsing tapped the blooded tome resting on the table. "We retrieve the Lumina crucifix. If we can use it to sever the Cremonios' connection to this world, we may be able to free your brother and end the covenant for good." Emil frowned. "But how do we weaken the entity enough for the crucifix to work?" Van Helsing's gaze darkened. "We force it to reveal itself during the ritual. If the Cremonios appears in its full form, it will be vulnerable. But that means putting Ilona directly in harm's way." Ilona stepped forward. "I understand the risk, Professor, but I've lost too much already. My brother, my family's honor. If this is what it takes to end the curse, then so be it." Before Van Helsing could respond, the distant cry of a wolf pierced the night, its mournful wail carrying through the castle's corridors. Ilona shivered, but Van Helsing's expression remained steady. "We leave now," he said firmly. "The longer we wait, the stronger the Cremonios becomes." The journey to the ancient sanctuary was treacherous. The wind howled through the narrow mountain passes, and the horses' hooves struggled to find purchase on the rocky terrain. Ilona clung to Van Helsing's arm as the carriage jolted and swayed, her breath fogging the air inside. When they finally arrived, the sanctuary loomed ahead, its stone walls covered in moss and ivy. The structure seemed half forgotten by time, as though the forest itself had tried to bury it. Van Helsing dismounted, helping Ilona down before retrieving his satchel of relics. "Stay close to me," he said. "The Cremonios will try to stop us." Emil followed behind, carrying a lantern that cast flickering beams of light across the sanctuary's weathered facade. They pushed open the heavy wooden doors and entered the dark, cold interior. The sanctuary was a vast, echoing chamber lined with crumbling statues of saints and angels whose faces had been worn smooth by centuries of neglect. At the far end of the room stood an altar, its surface covered in dust and dried wax. Behind it, an arched alcove held a stone pedestal where the Lumina crucifix lay, its surface dull but pulsing faintly with a hidden power. "There," Van Helsing whispered, pointing to the relic. As they approached, the air grew colder, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. Ilona stopped, her breath hitching. "Did you hear that?" "Yes," Van Helsing said, drawing a silver dagger from his belt. "We're not alone." The shadows along the walls shifted, and suddenly dark figures emerged from the alcoves, twisted forms with glowing red eyes and clawed hands. They moved quickly, their guttural snarls filling the air as they closed in. "Defend Ilona!" Van Helsing shouted, hurling a vial of holy water at the nearest creature. The liquid hissed as it made contact, and the creature recoiled, its skin burning as it dissolved into ash. Emil swung the lantern wildly, the flames casting erratic beams of light that disoriented the advancing creatures. Ilona grabbed a torch from the wall and thrust it toward one of the attackers, the flames driving it back. Van Helsing lunged for the altar, grabbing the Lumina crucifix. As his fingers closed around it, the relic flared to life, emitting a bright golden light that filled the chamber. The creatures screamed and writhed, their bodies disintegrating into shadows that dissolved into the floor. Breathing heavily, Van Helsing turned to Ilona. "Are you hurt?" "No," she replied. her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But we need to finish this." He nodded and held up the crucifix. "We have what we need. Now we prepare for the final battle." Emil approached, his face pale but determined. "Do you think we'll succeed?" Van Helsing's gaze was resolute. "We have to. The Cremonios has thrived on fear and sacrifice for too long. Tonight, we end it." As they made their way back to the carriage, the wind howled around them like a chorus of ghosts. Van Helsing clutched the crucifix tightly, its warmth seeping into his skin. Whatever horrors awaited them at the castle, he knew they would face them together. The crimson moon was rising higher, and with it, the final confrontation drew near. Chapter 6. Relic of Light, Revised. The wind howled like a wounded beast as Van Helsing, Ilona, and Emil ascended the narrow rocky path that wound through the dense forest. Above them, the gnarled branches of ancient trees formed a canopy that blocked what little light the crimson moon provided. The world around them felt suffused with malevolence, as if the forest itself were conspiring to slow their progress. The sanctuary they sought lay hidden deep within the Carpathian mountains, buried by time and obscured by the whispers of forgotten monks. The Lumina crucifix, their only hope of severing the Cremonios' grip on the Varda's bloodline, awaited them inside. But the journey to retrieve it was not without peril. "This place feels cursed," Ilona murmured, tightening her grip on Van Helsing's arm as they trudged forward. Her breath came in short gasps, visible in the frigid night air. "Many sacred places hold traces of both light and shadow," Van Helsing replied. "The monks who once guarded the crucifix knew what they were protecting. They hid it here to keep it from falling into the wrong hands." Emil, carrying the lantern that barely pierced the oppressive darkness, stumbled on a loose rock but quickly recovered. "And if the Cremonios knows what we're doing?" Van Helsing's gaze remained fixed ahead. "It knows. That's why we can't stop." As they reached the summit, the forest thinned, revealing the stone walls of the ancient sanctuary. Moss-covered and cracked by centuries of erosion, the structure appeared as if it had been carved from the very bones of the mountain. Its arched doorway, partially hidden by hanging vines, stood like the mouth of a tomb. "Stay close to me," Van Helsing instructed as he drew a silver dagger from his belt. "We don't know what waits inside." Ilona nodded, her face pale but determined. Emil lifted the lantern higher, casting flickering shadows on the weathered stone as they entered the sanctuary. The air inside was frigid, and their footsteps echoed ominously against the stone floor. Faded frescoes lined the walls, depicting scenes of monks battling demons, their eyes lifted toward the heavens in desperate prayer. Van Helsing traced his fingers along one of the frescoes, noting the symbols carved into the stone. "These are protection wards," he said. "They were meant to keep the darkness at bay, but they've faded." "Will that affect our ability to retrieve the crucifix?" Ilona asked. Van Helsing shook his head. "No. The crucifix's power lies within itself, but it does mean that whatever evil lurks here is no longer contained." They continued deeper into the sanctuary until they reached the central chamber. At its center stood a stone pedestal, and upon it lay the Lumina crucifix. Even in the dim light, the relic shimmered faintly as if a hidden fire burned within its core. "There it is," Emil whispered, awestruck. Van Helsing approached cautiously, scanning the room for any signs of danger. "Wait here," he said, holding up a hand to stop Ilona and Emil. He stepped forward, his footsteps careful and deliberate. The moment his fingers closed around the crucifix, the air shifted. A low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber, and the shadows along the walls seemed to ripple and come to life. "Get back," Van Helsing shouted, spinning around as dark figures emerged from the corners of the room. Their forms were twisted and monstrous, with glowing red eyes and elongated claws that scraped against the stone floor. Ilona gasped and drew her torch, the flames sputtering but holding steady. Emil swung the lantern wildly, casting erratic beams of light that disoriented the advancing creatures. Van Helsing thrust the crucifix forward, its golden light flaring and driving back the nearest creature. "Holy water," he called out. Emil fumbled with the vials in Van Helsing's satchel and tossed one to him. Van Helsing uncorked it and splashed the contents onto the floor, creating a barrier that hissed and steamed as the creatures recoiled. Ilona stood her ground, thrusting her torch toward an approaching figure. The flames caught its cloak, and the creature let out an ear-splitting shriek before disintegrating into ash. "They won't stop," Van Helsing said through gritted teeth. "We need to get out of here." With the crucifix clutched tightly in his hand, he led them back through the narrow corridor, the creatures chasing them with frenzied determination. Emil stumbled, but managed to keep his footing as Van Helsing splashed more holy water behind them, buying precious seconds. They burst through the sanctuary's entrance and into the open air. The night was cold and crisp, but the forest had lost its oppressive silence. Instead, the wind howled like a chorus of ghosts, carrying the fading cries of the creatures they had left behind. Van Helsing doubled over, catching his breath. Ilona leaned against a tree, her face flushed from exertion, while Emil collapsed to his knees, the lantern lying beside him. "Is it over?" Ilona asked between breaths. "For now," Van Helsing replied. "The crucifix is ours, but the hardest part is still ahead. The Cremonios will be waiting for us at the castle. It knows we have the weapon that can destroy it." Ilona straightened, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "And we face it tonight." Van Helsing nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "Tonight, we end this." As they made their way back to the carriage, the glow of the Lumina crucifix pulsed faintly, its warmth seeping into Van Helsing's hand. The relic was powerful, but they all knew that power alone would not be enough. They would need courage, sacrifice, and unshakable resolve to defeat an evil that had haunted Ilona's family for generations. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant cry of a wolf, or perhaps something far worse. But Van Helsing did not falter. The battle ahead would be their most dangerous yet, but he had faith that the shadows could be conquered. They had to be. The crimson moon hung heavy above them, casting its ominous glow on the path leading back to Castle Vardas. Chapter 7. The Crimson Moon, Revised. The carriage came to a stop at the base of Castle Vardas, just as the crimson moon reached its zenith, casting its eerie glow across the desolate grounds. The walls of the castle seemed alive under the blood-red light, their jagged edges stretching like talons against the night sky. The air was heavy, suffused with the scent of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of blood. Van Helsing, Ilona, and Emil dismounted swiftly, their breath forming clouds of vapor in the cold night air. Ilona clutched the Lumina crucifix to her chest, its faint warmth a lifeline against the encroaching dread. Van Helsing carried the silver dagger and several vials of holy water, while Emil carried a torch, its flickering flame casting frantic shadows as they hurried through the main entrance. "The Cremonios knows we're here," Van Helsing said as they ascended the grand staircase. His voice was calm, but his eyes darted to every shadow. "It will try to lure us into a trap. We must stay focused." Ilona nodded, her grip on the crucifix tightening. "We have the relic. We can end this." "Be ready for anything," Emil added, though his voice wavered slightly. The castle seemed to pulse with an ominous energy, its stone walls groaning under the weight of the evil they contained. Van Helsing led them through the labyrinthine corridors, their footsteps echoing like distant drumbeats. The path led them to the great hall where the air grew colder, and the flickering torchlight struggled against the growing darkness. At the center of the hall stood Radu, his once handsome face now gaunt and twisted, his eyes glowing with the same crimson hue as the moon above. He wore ceremonial robes stained with dried blood, and in his hands he held a curved dagger. "Ilona," Radu said, his voice a blend of warmth and malice. "You've come, just as I knew you would." "Radu, stop this," Ilona cried, stepping forward. "We can end the curse together. You don't have to do this." Radu laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "Don't you see? I've accepted my fate. The Cremonios has shown me the truth. There is no salvation, only power. And with your blood, sister, I will ascend." Before Van Helsing could respond, the room trembled, and from the shadows, the Cremonios began to take form. Its presence was suffocating, as if the air itself had grown thick with malice. The creature's body was a mass of shifting shadows, its eyes twin orbs of molten crimson, and its voice was a chorus of whispers and screams. "Flesh is but a vessel," the entity hissed, its gaze locking onto Ilona. "You will be the bridge between realms, and through you, I will reign eternal." Van Helsing raised the lumina crucifix, its light flaring and illuminating the hall. The Cremonios recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Now," Van Helsing shouted, "we must weaken it before we can use the crucifix to sever the covenant." Radu lunged toward Van Helsing, the curved dagger aimed at his chest. Van Helsing sidestepped the attack and struck Radu's arm with the silver dagger, the blade cutting deep. Radu howled in pain, but the wound only seemed to fuel his rage. He swung wildly, and Van Helsing barely managed to block the next strike with his forearm. "Ilona, the holy water!" Van Helsing called. Ilona tossed a vial to him, and he smashed it against Radu's chest. The liquid sizzled and steamed as it made contact, and Radu stumbled backward, clutching his chest. Emil fought off the shadowy tendrils that slithered toward them, using the torch to burn them before they could take hold. "They're everywhere," he shouted. "Focus on keeping them back," Van Helsing replied. Ilona stepped forward, holding the crucifix high. Its golden light intensified, casting the Cremonios into sharp relief. The entity thrashed and writhed, its form becoming unstable. "Radu, please," Ilona cried, tears streaming down her face. "Don't let it control you. Fight it." For a brief moment, Radu's eyes flickered with recognition, and his grip on the dagger loosened. But the Cremonios' influence was too strong. With a guttural roar, he lunged at Ilona, knocking her to the ground. The crucifix tumbled from her hands and skidded across the floor. Van Helsing acted quickly, driving the silver dagger into Radu's side. Radu screamed, and his body convulsed, but he did not fall. "Get the crucifix," Van Helsing shouted. Emil darted forward and retrieved the relic, tossing it to Ilona, just as the Cremonios surged forward, its shadowy tendrils reaching for her. She caught the crucifix and thrust it toward the entity, its light blazing with holy energy. The Cremonios shrieked, its form unraveling as the light consumed it. Van Helsing pulled Radu away from Ilona, holding him steady as the entity's influence began to wane. "Finish it," Van Helsing commanded. Ilona stood, her eyes filled with both grief and determination. She pressed the crucifix against Radu's chest, and the light exploded outward, bathing the entire hall in a blinding glow. The Cremonios let out a final agonized scream before disintegrating into a cloud of ash that dissipated into the air. When the light faded, Radu collapsed into Van Helsing's arms, his breathing shallow. His eyes, now free of the crimson glow, met Ilona's. "I'm sorry," he whispered, a tear sliding down his cheek. Ilona knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap. "You're free now, Radu. It's over." He smiled weakly before his body went limp. Ilona sobbed, her tears falling onto his blood-stained robes. Van Helsing placed a hand on her shoulder. His sacrifice wasn't in vain. "The Cremonios is gone." Emil slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. "It's over?" "For now," Van Helsing said, though his gaze remained fixed on the ashes scattered across the floor. "But evil has a way of returning. We must be vigilant." As dawn broke over the castle, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the shattered windows, casting golden beams across the room. The shadows that had haunted Castle Vardus for generations had finally been banished, but their scars remained. Van Helsing helped Ilona to her feet, her grief still heavy but tempered by a glimmer of hope. "Let's leave this place," she whispered. Together they walked out of the castle, leaving the remnants of the past behind, as the sun rose higher, promising a new beginning. Chapter 8. Ashes and Shadows Revised. The morning sun crept over the Carpathian hills, casting its golden light on the ruins of Castle Vardus. A soft mist clung to the earth like a shroud. and the only sound was the distant cry of a lone bird breaking the silence. The battle had been won, but its cost lay heavy on the shoulders of those who had survived. Van Helsing and Lady Ilona walked slowly through the castle's grand hall, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls that had witnessed centuries of secrets. The ashes of the Cremonias were scattered across the floor, their faint scent mingling with the cold air. The once monstrous presence that had haunted this place was gone, but the memories it had left behind were not so easily vanquished. Ilona stopped at the spot where her brother had drawn his final breath, her fingers brushing the blood-stained stone. The tears she had shed earlier had dried, but her grief was no less profound. He was brave, Van Helsing said, standing beside her. In the end, he fought against the darkness and freed himself. Ilona nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the ground. I only wish I could have saved him sooner. You saved him in the only way you could, Van Helsing replied gently. His soul is free now, and the curse is broken. The sound of footsteps made them turn. Emile entered the hall, his face pale but composed. He carried a bundle of cloth, which he placed carefully on the altar. I've gathered what's left of the Cremonios' ashes, he said. What should we do with them? Van Helsing thought for a moment. We'll scatter them far from here in sacred ground where they can do no harm. Let nature take back what was stolen. Emile nodded and turned to Ilona. And you? What will you do now? Ilona exhaled slowly, as if releasing the weight of generations with her breath. I can't stay here. This castle has been my prison, and it holds too many ghosts. I'll go to Vienna, live with my relatives for a while, and try to rebuild my life. Van Helsing's eyes softened. That's a wise choice. You deserve a life free of shadows. She gave him a faint smile, her first since the battle. And you? Where will you go? I'll return to London, Van Helsing said. There are always more battles to fight, more shadows to confront. But this one, at least, is over. They stood in silence for a moment, the enormity of their victory sinking in. The air felt lighter now, as though the castle itself had exhaled after centuries of holding its breath. Later that morning, they made their way to the castle's gates. The carriage waited, its horses restless as the driver adjusted their harnesses. Ilona carried a small bag, her belongings packed hastily but efficiently. Before she climbed into the carriage, she turned to Van Helsing. Thank you, Professor, for everything. He took her hand and bowed slightly. If you ever need me, Lady Ilona, you know where to find me. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I hope we never face such darkness again. But if we do, I'll be ready. As the carriage rumbled away down the winding path, Van Helsing watched until it disappeared into the mist. He turned to Emile, who stood quietly beside him. She'll heal, Emile said, but it will take time. Time is a powerful healer, Van Helsing agreed, and so is distance from this place. They re-entered the castle one final time to gather Van Helsing's belongings. The library was quiet, the blooded tome resting on the table where they had left it. He ran his fingers over its worn leather cover, then tucked it into his satchel. This story, too, would find its place in the annals of history, a reminder of how close darkness had come to triumph. As they exited the castle for the last time, Van Helsing paused at the threshold. The morning sun had burned away most of the mist, revealing the forest beyond. Birds chirped from the treetops, and the scent of pine filled the air. It's almost peaceful, Emile said. Almost, Van Helsing replied, but peace is always fragile. They walked toward the carriage that would take them to the train station. As they boarded, Van Helsing's mind was already racing ahead, contemplating the next steps, the next shadows he might be called to face. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The train pulled away from the station, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against tracks lulling him into a rare state of calm. He gazed out the window as the landscape blurred past, his thoughts lingering on Ilona's strength, Radu's sacrifice, and the lingering threat of the unknown. Just as he closed his eyes, the conductor approached, handing him a letter sealed with an unfamiliar wax crest. Van Helsing broke the seal and read the contents quickly. His brow furrowed, and he folded the letter with deliberate precision before slipping it into his coat pocket. "What is it?" Emil asked, sensing the shift in his mood. Van Helsing sighed and leaned back against the seat, a reminder that evil is never truly vanquished. Someone else needs our help. Emil didn't press further, and the train continued its journey through the Carpathian wilderness, leaving behind the ashes of Castle Varders. As the sunlight streamed through the window, Van Helsing whispered to himself, "Wherever the shadows stretch, we will be there to meet them." The battle had ended, but the war against darkness was eternal.